Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first event that has been co-sponsored by the Institute for Environmental Education, the new California Studies program at SRJC, and the Arts and Lectures Committee. So this is a first. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce a longtime friend, Dr. Don Vallejo, who is going to be speaking to you today. He is the director of the California Institute of Rural Studies in Davis, California, that just commemorated its 20th year in existence. And we have a whole free newsletter and reports that the Institute have published over here if you'd like to pick up some of this literature on the way out. He's one of the leading experts on California agriculture and agricultural policy issues in the state, including farm labor, water, pesticides, and issues around land use, particularly in the Central Valley, but all over the state of California. And CIRS has done numerous studies for the state and federal government, various foundations on agricultural issues and farm labor issues over the last 20 years. Currently, CIRS is involved in a project funded by the James Irvine Foundation called the Central Valley Partnership for Citizenship Project, in which literacy skills and voting and language skills are being provided to new immigrant populations into the Central Valley. And parenthetically, while we're talking about voter registration in this introduction, if you haven't registered to vote, and or if you've changed your residency in the last year since the last election, there are voting registration forms right over here. CIRS also has a grant from the National Institute of Safety and Health to study the health status of children who are migrant workers and who are working in agriculture in California today. CIRS also is working on a project funded by the United States Department of Agriculture regarding how farmers now in the West San Joaquin Valley are going to be coping with reduced usage of water in farming techniques there. And finally, through the California State Department of Agriculture, CIRS is studying alternatives to pesticide use in the almond and walnut industries in the Central Valley. I think one of the things that's most unique about Don Vallejo's work over the last 20 years and that of CIRS is their attempt to bring together various constituencies, new immigrant populations, labor, consumers, environmentalists, in an attempt to find a common ground in relationship to the problems that the Great Central Valley in California and Californians in general are confronting in the 21st century. And so his talk today is entitled California's Great Central Valley, Class, Race, and the Environmental Crisis of the 21st Century. And he'll talk until just about 1 o'clock or thereafter, and then we'll have questions and answers. I also wanted to announce that someone else who has talked to the Environmental Forum last year, Dr. Marion Moses, she is author of Designer Poisons, How to Protect Your Health and Home from Toxic Pesticides. And she's also president of the Pesticide Education Network and long been active in issues around pesticides in agriculture, and particularly the impact on farm labor. She is going to be speaking this Thursday from 7:30 to 9:30 in Andrews Hall in Sonoma. And if that's something that interests you, I'll have this over here. In particular, she's going to be talking about the growing problem of pesticides in the vineyards in Sonoma County. So please welcome Dr. Don Vallejo.
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your participation in today's event. And I especially want to thank Roberta Dunham of the Committee on Arts and Lectures, George Freund and Jerry Waxman of the Institute for Environmental Education, and Marty Bennett of the California Studies Program for very kindly inviting me to appear today and for arranging for all of the little details to make things work right. For the last, 25 years, it's been my privilege to be able to wander around rural California, agricultural areas, small towns, and talk to people. And it's a great treat. And what I have been able to do is listen a lot and record what I've been told and record what I see, and then try to sift through all of this information and try to understand what is going on. And the way in which I'd like to begin today is to revisit with you what the Central Valley of California looks like and looked like before European civilization descended. And that's the way I think about it. And what I am showing here, let's see, I do my lights by set low. There we go. What we're showing here is the, as near as we can figure out, the landscape of the Central Valley before Europeans stumbled upon it. And the valley extends roughly from Redding in the north down to Arvin in the south, about 400 miles in extent. In width, at its widest point, probably about 75 miles. And before Europeans arrived, we think there were, in the whole of California, about 100,000 Native Americans. So the wilderness is a kind of a myth because the Native American population seeded, burnt over grass to replant, and established a life that was, in some sense, in harmony with nature. The features of the valley that I always find fascinating are the existence of Tulare Lake, 5 times bigger than Lake Tahoe, so big that it was crossed by steamboat in the 19th century. Boats would come up from the San Francisco Bay up through the San Joaquin River and extend farther and farther, deeper and deeper, going uphill as they go south in the valley, and eventually, in wet years, could make their way to Tulare Lake. Marshland, that's shown in this kind of shaded form, extended for more than 1.5 million acres, and this is freshwater marsh, providing habitat for many, many species. Saltwater marsh, of course, we know about because that's what the fight around the Bay Delta concerns. But also lands that were encrusted with salt deposits, perhaps remnants of a period in time when this entire region was an inland lake. Tulare Lake and the marshes all up and down the valley are fed by, or were fed by, the rivers that flow out of the Sierra Nevada, the Kern River, the Tule River, other rivers that you're familiar with. And interestingly, on the rain shadow side of the Coast Range, there is no named river and no named permanent creek. So essentially, we had a valley that was filled with water every rainy year and by the melting snowpack that accumulated at the bottom of the valley, and a little ridge just south of Fresno, higher than the surrounding area, trapped the runoff and made Tulare Lake. Quite an extraordinary phenomena for people who go through that region today and see what the valley looks like now. And it's sort of useful to think about what the valley once looked like to give us a perspective of what the future really holds for us. Because there are forces underway that are imagining like a wild runaway careening truck that's kind of hard to stop. And these forces are very powerful. And they're transforming the valley as we speak. John Muir, who's best known for his work in the mountains of California, wrote a wonderful piece that's in a little book called Highway 99 that I commend to you to take a look at, of walking from the south end of the valley all the way to the north. And at the time of the year he did this walk in the spring, There was a carpet of wildflowers in every direction as far as he could see that overwhelmed him with fragrance and a spectacular view. A view that, sadly, we're not going to be able to enjoy in our lifetime. There's another book that I would commend to you as well, and that is California History, published a double edition in the summer and fall of 1997, about what California was like before 1848, and begins with a beautiful piece by Michael Barber on the native species of California, grasslands that extended throughout the whole Central Valley that have almost all but disappeared. The Central Valley is a place that most folks, even California residents, know relatively little about. For example, our population in the Central Valley grew at twice the rate of the statewide population growth in the period 1980-1990. 1 out of 3 new Californians in the next 20 years will either be born in or will move to the Central Valley. 7 million more people will live there in the next 2 decades. The director of the Great Valley Center, located in Modesto, and the former mayor of Modesto, Carol Whiteside, thinks about the future of the valley in, I think, a very interesting way. She said, if San Francisco signified California for the 19th century and Los Angeles for the 20th century, the Central Valley will define California for the 21st century. And the reason that she put this forward is that, as I indicated earlier, there are forces in motion that are so enormous that it's hard to even grasp. After learning about what the pre-European waterscape looked like, it's kind of a shock to discover that we have 1,200 dams. We have over 5,000 miles of aqueducts and canals. Tulare Lake is gone because all of the tributaries that fed it have now been dammed. Dammed to provide irrigation water, to provide drinking water, and actually as well to control flooding that would periodically occur, that led to the formation of Tulare Lake, after all. And so today, we have a waterscape that is as artificial as one can imagine. In an area on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, for example, when there's less than 5 inches of rainfall a year, we also have the world's most productive agricultural region, fed by that water system. This is the California Aqueduct that meanders down the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. And in the background, you can see actually a citrus orchard that is irrigated with that water. And so an extraordinary thing has happened in the last 150 years. And that extraordinary thing is the development of the richest agricultural region in the world, thanks to, in some sense, the destruction of the natural habitat. Many people think that agriculture is in decline in California. The fight around land use, that's happening in the Central Valley, is one example of that issue. We've lost 200,000 acres of farmland to urban development in the course of the last 20 years in the Central Valley. But little noticed is something that I think is very crucial and is the centerpiece of the economy of the Central Valley today and our future. This shows annual harvested tonnage of fruits and vegetables in California over the course of the last roughly 20 years. And we've gone from about 16 or 16.5 million tons a year up to a little over 32 or 33 million tons a year in that 20-year period. This is an extraordinary growth in production. When I was a kid, my basic diet, the 4 food groups, were sugar, salt, caffeine, and grease. right? But I've been reformed because of the abundance of fruits and vegetables and the possible long-term harmful impact of my preferred diet. So you and I, by eating more fresh fruits and vegetables, even fast food restaurants now have salad bars, and exports that we send all over the world of this abundance are driving a growth in our agricultural production. And there is no one who thinks that this trend is going to flatten out or let alone turn around. In fact, as we speak, negotiations have been concluded with China, and we'll be sending table grapes from the Central Valley of California to China at a reduced tariff rate next year. This year, 600,000 cartons of table grapes from California went to Vietnam, a poor country. But people wanted that fruit so much they were willing to pay the premium price that we demand. So we are a cornucopia for the world. One of the things that's occurred that's kind of interesting in, I think, fueling this trend, very little noticed, is that if you look at the change in net cash return from farming for all California farms, and I'm using the Census of Agriculture years that are most recent, 87 and 92, all farms lost ground in California in terms of their cash position. From the point of view of the farmer, prices and the return they get from selling their crops haven't kept up with the increase of costs. Costs have risen faster than what they can get in sales, and so they're losing ground. But if you look at just those specialty crops that we were examining before, vegetable, melon, fruit, nut, berry, they behaved in the opposite fashion. Their net cash return as a whole, statewide, in those categories improved. And an important consequence of that, in other words, the fact that it's still possible for some farmers at least to make money growing those crops, we have seen an extraordinary increase in plantings of vines and trees. You've seen some of that in your neighborhood over here. In fact, coming over today from the Central Valley, I noticed more vineyards going in every direction. But the degree to which that's happening in the Central Valley is quite extraordinary. We've gone from about 1.58 million acres of bearing trees and vines in 87 up to 1.85 million acres of bearing acres in the most recent year we have data for, 97. And it's driven by that larger return that people seem to be able to get from growing certain crops. We've added over 300,000 acres of trees and vines in the Central Valley. And you say, now wait a minute, I thought we're losing agricultural land to development. I thought that around Modesto and Fresno and these other large towns, vineyards and orchards are being taken out and replaced with houses. Well, that's true. That's certainly true. But in other parts of the valley that are not next to the freeways, especially the west side of both valleys, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin Valley, hundreds of thousands of acres of trees and vines are going into land that used to be pasture, that used to be planted to oats and barley and wheat, that used to be dedicated to what we call extensive crops and livestock. And the reason that's occurring is that farmers, like everyone else, has to pay attention to the bottom line. And it's in those commodities that we're seeing that improved economic return. So farmers are paying attention to that. A little noticed in the press today was President Clinton introducing a $7 billion emergency farm relief bill for grain farmers in the Midwest, because grain prices are so low this year that most grain farmers are going to lose money. And balance that, think about that in the context of last year, when in this state we had $26.8 billion in farm gate sales. That's a heck of a big number. I'll never see that in my life in one place, I know that. But wrapping my head around it is kind of hard. So the way I think about it is imagine everybody who goes to the movies all year long, all over the world. The box office receipts for the entire motion picture industry is only 1/3 as big as last year's cash return on farm sales in the state of California. So my question is, let's have an Academy Award for the best vineyard, the best orchard, the fastest picker of melons. This phenomena of intensification of agriculture in the state is perhaps the single most important economic development in the Central Valley today. We studied an area around Firebaugh, which is on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, about 35 miles west of Fresno. Huge zip code area, covers 400 square miles. Land that had historically been used for livestock, extensive crop production, alfalfa, cotton. And just in the last few years, look at the spurt of plantings of deciduous tree fruit, of vineyards, even citrus. More spectacular was the increase of vegetable and melon plantings, up to about 65,000 acres just in that area. More garlic now than all of Santa Clara County around the Gilroy Garlic Festival. More garlic than that whole area. 20,000 acres of melons. This intensification of agriculture that's occurring is providing employment and is in response to a worldwide growth in demand for these commodities. And so what we've seen in Firebaugh, just in the years since 1992, is Del Monte Fresh Produce setting up shop. Gargiulo Inc. setting up shop. They grow all kinds of tomatoes. They used to be owned by Monsanto, and their prize commodity is the Flavor Saver tomato. It has a shelf life of 90 days. Think about that. And other fresh produce firms have now set up. They're adding, we think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 800 jobs in a community where there's only 2,000 workers. So part of what happens as a result of this intensification of agriculture is a change in the way work is being done on farms. In the red square boxes is the Employment Development Department's estimate of the annual labor contribution, employment, represented by farmers and family members in California. And essentially what's going on is a very steep decline, particularly in recent years. In contrast, folks hired by farmers directly, in other words, farm employees, declined a little bit, then seemed to level off, and then seems to be going back up some. Today, we think that farmers and unpaid family labor represents about 15% of the total labor needed on our farms, versus 40% a generation and a half ago. So as our farms become more intensive, we need more labor, and that labor is being increasingly supplied by hired workers. When EDD does this enumeration, they forgot an important part of our labor force, and that's the folks who work for farm labor contractors. Crew leaders who round up crews of workers and bring them to a farm and do a job for a fee. They're not farm employees. The farmer doesn't employ them. They're employed by the labor contractor. And the growth in employment by labor contractors has reached a point where at least 1/3 of all California farm employment is now supplied by labor contractors. And a majority of the work at harvest time in the Central Valley is supplied by labor contractors. So EDD forgot about the labor contractors. What happens if you fold it all in and take a look at farm employment of hired workers as a whole? What we find is about a 30% increase in hired worker employment in California agriculture over the past 20 years. Now that's kind of puzzling. We thought agriculture was going away, there's less agricultural land. How can we have more workers? Well, we've substituted those intensive crops for livestock and extensive crop. So where there used to be one or two folks, maybe family farmers, farming 600 or 1,000 acres, melons, tomatoes, orchards may require hundreds of workers. And that's why the employment's going up. An interesting puzzle that I'll just throw out to you and let you reflect on is that most places in the world measure progress in terms of employment in manufacturing, the new industries, high-tech service, and so forth, and boast of how agricultural employment is going down, and that's a measure of progress. Well, we seem to be charting new territory. Agricultural employment is going up. We need more farm workers, and we need more each year. When we look at the demographics of, for example, the Fireball community, where I talked about the increase in intensity of farming, unfortunately we're limited to, as you're probably aware, enumerations by the census of population. And in that 400 square miles, the population seemed to have gone up by maybe 400 folks or so. But the foreign-born population went up by 800. The Hispanic population went up by 1,000. And the folks who don't speak English very well went up by about another 800. In that period, Firebaugh added exactly one housing unit to its housing stock. We now have 40 communities in the Central Valley that are like Firebaugh, where the Hispanic population is in the majority. We have communities like Huron, where the Hispanic population is 97% of the total, where everybody on the street, in business, at home, TV, radio, print media, speak or read Spanish. And to us, it's one of the ironies of our time that in the school system, we're not going to allow them to speak Spanish, or at least we're going to discourage it if we can. My dad learned to speak English at age 11 by reading. His dad was a cigar maker, Cuban cigar maker, actually. My dad learned to read English by picking up the only newspaper available, which was in English, and trying to simultaneously translate it into Spanish as a reader in the cigar shop. He didn't learn it in the school. So we now have a paradox in our state. 1 out of every 4 Central Valley residents is an immigrant. 1 out of 4. A majority of those immigrants have arrived here within the last 10 years. We have a social structure, a government structure, a university structure, an education structure that is struggling mightily with how to cope with what this presents. And one of the forces that's coming down the road relates to the fact that the immigrant population is very young, peak childbearing years, have twice as many kids on average as does the majority population. And even if you could close every border and seal it up tight, the population growth in these communities will double in the next 10 years. There's nothing you can do about it. It's going to happen. So as a challenge, we have in the Central Valley communities that are doubling every 10 years. And what do we do about social services? What do we do about infrastructure? How do we cope with the multiplicity of languages? How do we deal with it? Well, at the Institute for Rural Studies, we argue we all have to sit down together and talk about it. We want to bring together community leaders, farmers, employers, elected officials, school teachers, immigrants, unions, and let's figure out what we can do together. That's our basic theory. These official statistics mask something else that's going on that is, I think, a crisis of potentially enormous proportion. And what I'm talking about is what we call the invisible population. We went to another Central Valley town, Parlier, 20 miles southeast of Fresno, and we asked the question, did the census find everybody? Did the census know how to locate and enumerate everybody? Now remember, the census sends out a mailing to every household address they can find, and they wait for the responses. And if the response rate from a given community is too low, then they send out some enumerators to go to those houses that didn't send back mail. Well, what we found in Parlier was very interesting. The open rectangles and squares are houses with a regular street address, recognized by the post office. All of the dark squares and rectangles are what I would call informal housing structures. Sometimes they're a garage, sometimes they're a tool shed, sometimes they're a barn, sometimes they're a set of basically plywood structures that have been put together on a temporary basis to house folks. None of those dark boxes have addresses. None of those dark boxes have telephones. Many of the boxes have TV sets with VCRs to watch Spanish movies. And many places have boom boxes. And many of the kids have skateboards. And so it's a very active and lively community. Many of the folks who live in those boxes have started businesses, rolling carts selling tacos or helados, ice creams. Very entrepreneurial-oriented group. But none of the folks in those dark squares got counted. So we set out a simple task, or at least in principle simple, to find every place where people were actually living in the whole town, enumerate, that is list, all of those places, and then randomly select places to go visit and interview people. So we get front houses and we get back houses as well. And it's extraordinary what you turn up. This is where a bunch of folks live. This is a bed. This is a wash basin shared by 20 men. This is the living room. If we do the enumeration, you find that in the front houses, which is the light shaded, we have a predominance of traditional nuclear families. We have very many fewer extended family households, that is with grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles and primos. Very few households composed of single or unaccompanied men. When we look in the back houses, it's almost the opposite. Very few nuclear families, incredibly complex extended families, and then a significant number of households where there are only unaccompanied men. When we look at income, use of social insurance, and other aspects of community health, we find that in the back houses, nearly 70% have annual incomes below $6,000. About 2/3 don't have any health insurance of any kind. And remarkably, considering the very low incomes, very little utilization of Medicare, Medicaid, very little utilization of food stamps. Essentially, they're not included in the social support networks of the community. And there's a good reason. Most of them are here without benefit of INS approval. So here's the first big issue that we face for the future of the Central Valley. 700,000 people work in this agricultural system. 92% are foreign born. 92%. 1/3 don't have papers. We interviewed the kids of these farm workers in Parlier, and a big 3% of the kids born here said they would consider working in agriculture. 97%, no way, we're going to junior college, we're out of here, man. So we have a dilemma. We have this very successful and very important agricultural system, the core of the economy of the Central Valley, but nobody born here wants to work on it, or very few. So we're going to have to go to other places to find people who want to do that work. Not only that, when we bring those folks here, their kids born here don't want to do this work. They want to have a life like all of us. Forever into the future, we are now dependent on a foreign-born labor force. Wow. Now, how does that reconcile with official immigration policy? How does that reconcile with the perspective of our esteemed governor, or the others who are trying to do whatever they can to root out every last unauthorized immigrant? It doesn't compute, gang. I'm not going to present solutions to you, but what I'm going to say is that this is a fundamental crisis, so deep that nobody wants to talk about it in public. That's when you know something is really bad, when nobody wants to talk about it in public. We also found that when we compared our findings with the official census findings, big surprise, considering who they missed, that the proportion of foreign-born that we turned up was very much higher than what turned up in the census. That is, US-born, foreign-born in the census, US-born, foreign-born when we started counting everybody. In fact, the census missed 28%, 1/4 of the entire town. That's why the fight around the census, we think, is very important. And when we looked at occupation, again, big surprise, we found a much higher proportion of the town doing hired farm work. Okay, we found them. Hey, big deal. Another big crisis we face that is associated with the intensification of agriculture pertains to agricultural chemical use. There's no enumeration of how much stuff we've been using every year until 1990. And so if we want to go far back in time, the only thing we have available is the agricultural census every 5 years and reports of what farmers say they're using on their place in agricultural chemical expense dollars. So we've corrected for price over time, and this is the trend in California when you look at agricultural chemical use. And this is not farmers saying we got to dump more stuff on the ground. No, this is more and more intensive crop production. Because you don't use much chemicals in pasture, if any at all. And you use very little in barley and oats and wheat. It's when you got several tens of thousands of dollars in an acre of vineyard investment that you start to worry. And that's when chemical usage goes up. And it isn't just the amount on average each farmer is using. This is actually the same data for the number of farms reporting agricultural chemical use. And so the number of farms, the trend is kind of up and down because we have a lot of variation from year to year. But in the last couple of censuses, if that's a proper word, 87, 92, certainly a lot more than the 69 and 74. Numbers of farms reporting agricultural chemical use. So more farms are using it as well as using more. As I indicated, in 1990, for the first time, we had accurate data on how much quantity in pounds of active ingredient that we're actually using. And that's because our Department of Pesticide Regulation, which by and large does a good job, certainly of collecting information from farmers on their use, was able to report to us under full use reporting, starting in 1990, this trend. Now, we had a drought in 91, 92, and we've had some recovery since. So I average these 3 years and compare it to those 3 years, just to get a sense of how much it's grown. Well, it's grown about 19% in the millions of pounds of active chemical ingredient that we're using. It's now about 200 million pounds per year. That's about 6 pounds for each of us. One part of the story of agricultural chemicals is that because they are called economic poisons in the language of law, which certainly is an oxymoron if I've ever heard one, because they are in many cases very dangerous materials, we've enacted rules after a long fight at both the federal and state level to try to protect people who are working in the fields. The Worker Protection Standard, adopted in 1995 on a national basis, requires that every agricultural employee who enters a field that is treated at any time in the year with a restricted material must receive training in safety and must be able to learn how to protect themselves. So we asked the simple question, by going to workers, did you get trained? And let's go back a step. Have you ever heard of the Worker Protection Standard? And let's go back even another step. Have you ever heard of the US EPA? Do you know that there are laws designed to protect you? It's really the question. Here's how we did it. We went to, these are migrant family housing centers that are all over the state, funded by the state of California. We went to the Dixon camp in Yolo County, the Madison camp in Yolo County, the Lodi camp, and the French camp one actually is on Matthews Lane. And we went to one more. We went to the Davis camp, which is not shown on this map for some crazy reason. And we talked to everybody there. Then we went someplace else as well. We went to motels where farm workers were known to live. We went to apartment buildings where we found, in one case, 15 guys sharing an apartment. We went to clandestine camps. We went to places where people were living under trees. And in Spanish, asked everybody those simple questions. Ever heard of the US EPA? Ever heard of the Worker Protection Standard? Have you been trained as the law requires? Do you know your rights? Did 115 interviews in Yolo County, 373 in San Joaquin County. As I said, we went to public labor camps, and we went to private camps, motels, all kinds of other places. Results were pretty surprising. 22% had actually heard of the US EPA. Most had not. About 18% had heard of the Worker Protection Standard. Most had not. This is 2 years after the law was in effect. Had you received pesticide safety training? Now, we separated out in Yolo and San Joaquin County for a reason I'll mention very shortly. About a third had the required training in Yolo County, 2/3 not. In San Joaquin County, only 10% had the required training, 90% not. And we think the main reason that that occurred is that we had many, many more interviews in the public camps in Yolo County proportionately than we did in San Joaquin County. And in the public camps, what we find is AmeriCorps volunteers out there teaching workers about their rights and teaching workers about how to protect themselves when they're working in the fields. We think that's a good program because they speak the language of the workers. In many cases, they're former farm workers themselves. or children of former farm workers, and they know how to talk. It's a good program. We like it. And so you can see that effect. In the Yolo County camps, 2/3 of the workers had received their training, whereas in those clandestinos, very few. Interesting effect. Then we asked everybody, are you aware that this stuff might be dangerous? And more than 3/4 said yes, they knew that it would be dangerous, but they didn't know how to protect themselves, and they didn't know they had rights under the law. That's the bottom line. In just a minute, I'm going to end, and you can ask me everything you want. Okay. Last week, the United States Department of Labor released a study they have conducted of safety, health, and labor law compliance in the grape industry. They listed about 8,000 farm employers, labor contractors, wineries, and others who employ hired farm workers, and did a random selection in each county where grapes are significant to go visit and do surprise inspections to see what they could find. The inspections were done between January and April of 1998, this year. They found that half of the labor contractors were paying below the minimum wage. 1/5 of the grape farm operators were paying below the minimum wage. I suggest to you that we do have a crisis. The crisis is we have a rich, a beautiful, fantastic agricultural system, but at its core there is danger, there is injustice, there is damage to the environment, and we need to figure out how to fix it. Thank you. Question in the back. How do you communicate? How do you educate with a population that is not accustomed to dealing with government, is suspicious of government, and really is not able to deal with written instructions on labels that are only in English? Question.
Do you see any significant changes or trends in the ethnic composition of the farm laborers in the
Yes. What we see is a greater diversity in the places of origin. And in terms of the long-term trend, Cheryl Peterson, who was a sociologist here at Cal State University, Sonoma, I don't know if she's still there, did a wonderful study in 1967 in which she found that about half of California farm workers in that year, 1967, were foreign-born, half U.S.-born. Today, 92% foreign-born. So it's really quite a significant change. But in terms of the ethnic composition, much more diverse, different places in Mexico that folks are coming from. For example, about 50,000 folks come from the state of Oaxaca, mostly indigenous folks, speaking Mixtec language, Zapotec language, Triqui language. For them, Spanish is a second language, English a third. And I've met some trilingual Mixtec activists. They're quite amazing, considering how poor my Mixtec skills are. Other question? Yes?
The composition of California agriculture is completely different from other states. I mean, we have an industry.
That's right.
In California. We're not talking about, and I think one of the bad things that's happened in California is the small farmer has been wiped out, and it's going to be wiped out because of corporate farming. The corporate farming is responsible for the pictures that you show. They're responsible for the poverty, but they're going to continue to import people from Mexico. They're going to pour and keep pouring in illegally, and they'll hire them illegally and break all of these until those people get organized and begin to develop some power against them. You're going to continue to have these problems.
Thank you. I think your perspective is interesting. Let me just respond to 3 points. With respect to the small-scale farming, we're seeing something quite interesting in recent years, and it's worth noting. And that is we're seeing a significant growth of smaller-scale, what I would call niche farmers. Organic farming is a good example of that. People growing flowers and selling them by the side of the road as I was coming up today. And as well, we're seeing among the new settlers, Southeast Asian immigrants, Mexican immigrants, this tremendous entrepreneurial spirit. And so in Fresno County, there are today 600 Southeast Asian operated farms that didn't exist 20 years ago. And that's really very interesting. And they do things in a little bit different way. They sell by the roadside mostly. They even have some U-pick operations. And then they sell to Asian restaurants directly. And there's, if you noticed, Asian restaurants, California, hey, there's a few. And so that's a big market for them. And I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. So you're right in the sense that we are dominated by large-scale agriculture, but because the system is expanding so much, particularly the fruits and vegetables, there appear to be opportunities for people to get in and do a niche market. And I'm not as discouraged about small farming as some people might be. We now have 1% of our production is organic. Well, as compared to 0%, 25 years ago, that's a big change. So there's some encouragement there. There are also folks who are trying to behave responsibly. I spoke in Huron on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley at the beginning of August with a farmer who employs 400 people. He loves his workforce. They're very good folks. They work in the melons. He knows that half of them, in the words of a letter from the Social Security Administration, don't seem to have records in the Social Security database. And what he's going to do about it is he's going to go with a lawyer to the Social Security Administration and say, these are my people, they're doing a good job, I want Social Security numbers, and if you won't give them Social Security numbers, I want the money back that I paid on their Social Security. I think it's a great argument. He's a very nice guy, Steve Couture. With respect to how we can deal with these questions. As we speak, the Congress is debating a proposal that emanated from the employers to bring in, on a non-immigrant basis, on a temporary basis, hundreds of thousands of additional Mexicans every year. They call it a guest worker program, except guests will not be allowed to bring their wives, their kids. They will not have the right to leave the job, even if the employer is violating the law. If they do leave the job, they're subject to immediate deportation. Think about that. Right. So, it's really quite a proposal. So everybody here, if you want to do something about this, you can write a letter to the White House right now and give Bill Clinton something positive to do. He needs something positive to do. It's the old Bracero program, and that's the employer's view of how to solve this crisis. We think it's a bad idea. One proposal would even withhold 25% of people's wages as hostage money until they return back home. Now imagine getting paid minimum wage and having 25% withheld. How many U.S. workers would put up with that? So I think it's important that people write to the White House and say no to the guest worker bill. With respect to the organization, again, I think things are very interesting. About 1994, a year after Cesar Chavez passed, Arturo Rodriguez decided to give up on the grape boycott, although he'll never say so publicly, and return to the fields. And I thought that was a great decision. And I wrote to him a personal letter saying, right on. And so you do have substantial initiatives going on today in union organizing in California agriculture. And right over here in Sonoma County, that spiffy new Gallo vineyard, the workers voted for union representation, but Gallo won't sit down at the table and negotiate. So everybody in this room, you can write a letter to Gallo and tell them what you think about that. It'd be a simple thing for Gallo, all the money they're making, to sit down and talk with workers who get, dig this, out of one bottle of wine, the workers wages are 11 cents out of one bottle of wine. So when you pay 25 bucks at a restaurant for a bottle of wine, think about it, 11 cents. I think Mr. Gallo can afford a little bit more. Yeah. Sure. That's a really interesting question. Most folks who don't have insurance tend to go to the pharmacist, as they do in Mexico, and buy stuff over the counter. Folks will actually return to Tijuana or to Mexicali and go there to get stuff that's not available over the counter here. Or they'll go to a family herbal medication that's been passed down from grandma to grandma. Or they'll go to a curandero, a native healer. And very often people will get massages, they'll get ointments, they'll take herbal medications and so forth. There was a very interesting study that we published, written by Bonnie Bade, who's a professor of anthropology at Cal State San Marcos, in which she looked at indigenous women from Oaxaca living in the Madera area and their health practices. And the shocker to me upon reading it for the first time, and I'm sort of the boss here at the Institute for Rural Studies, so I got to review everything, was the fact that folks believed in the evil eye. That is, that many conditions were caused by the evil eye. And that in some cases she reported people having, in their terms, dealt with the evil eye and then getting better. And I had to sort of think about that, rooted in Western medical practice, and you take a pill and stuff like that. And I had to digest that and think about, well, it's probably the case that people who believe that that happens, may actually sort of control to some extent some behaviors, including behaviors that manifest themselves in health. So I had to say, oh my goodness, we got to rethink this stuff. Now, the other thing that she reported was that a lot of folks go without. And some folks, if it's really a crisis, if it's really a disaster, will go to the emergency room. Because if you don't have some health insurance, that's a place that you might get help. But people, by and large, I say, neglect the preventive kinds of things that you and I are accustomed to doing, and therefore, they're all crises waiting to happen. And they have manifested themselves in many ways. We had a measles outbreak in 89-90 in this state, where we had 3,000 cases of measles in the Central Valley, including 500 in Fresno County alone. We had 30 deaths, whereas in the previous 10 years, there had not been a single death from measles. And it was almost exclusively among hired farm workers whose living conditions, lack of immunization, and so forth, really set them up for that kind of outbreak. The second measure that we have is very disturbing, and this is from the community of McFarland, California, which is near Bakersfield, due to the fact that there were 17 kids in this town of 6,000 that came down with cancer, all living in a 6-block area in a period of about a dozen years. The community got very upset, and since just about everybody in town's a farm worker, they thought it might be pesticides. In fact, some folks even concluded without evidence that it must have been pesticides. The Department of Health came in and examined every child between age of 1 and 12. Every single child in town. Full screening, looked for everything. Thank God, no more cancers were found, okay? The bad news is that 71% of the children needed a medical referral. 71%. I assert that's unacceptable in the United States. Most had not been to a dentist ever. Most had not been to an eye doctor for just basic vision care. And so what people do when they're in these circumstances is they put off the preventive stuff that you and I kind of take for granted, and then they're all sort of time bombs waiting to explode. Not a good plan. Not a good plan. And the thing that's hard to grasp in this is that if you're a farmer growing vegetables and you go for the regular straight commercial marketplace, you don't have a whole lot of choices. For example, today there are 10 lettuce packer shippers that control a majority of lettuce production in this state. And they do it with joint deal agreements with individual growers, under which the grower agrees to surrender the control and marketing of the crop to the packer shipper, companies like Dole, Tanamura, and Antle. Very, very big, powerful companies. And so as a grower, you don't have much power there. That's why some, I would say, more innovative, smaller producers, particularly those who are trying to do sustainable agriculture practices, try to find other ways of marketing, whether it's farmers markets, whether it's direct sales to restaurants, whether it's other ways of getting around that big bottleneck. But there is an issue there. And the issue that we see is exactly what you point out, a stranglehold that these very large companies have on most of the producers in the industry. Now, we think that a long-term solution is essentially to apply antitrust law. That was tried in the past successfully, but we have an administration that's been pretty weak on that question. With respect to transgenic development, the most recent development is the expanded use of what's called Roundup Ready seed, for example, in the cotton industry. Now, Roundup, as you know, is a pretty benign agricultural chemical that's used for treating ground for weeds. Essentially, it's an herbicide for getting rid of weeds. Now, the Monsanto company has the patent on this Roundup Ready cotton, and so they're selling it to farmers saying, hey, you can get rid of all that weeding crew and all the crew of people you have to hire to go in there and clean up the weeds. Because if you use this Roundup Ready cotton, then you can spray the heck with Roundup, and you won't have all that labor expense. Well, the interesting question has emerged. What will be the long-term effect? There are about 16 cotton farmers today who are suing the Monsanto company because they've seen the effects already. They have seen in their fields much lower yields, much poorer quality cotton, and they don't think that variety is very good. The Monsanto company says, hey, we have evidence that everybody who's using it on average is doing just as well as everyone else, and you guys are bad farmers. It's serious litigation around it. That is one of the issues that's coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, that's lying beneath your question. Yes? Sure. That's a very good question. There are many who argue that, for example, on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, where we do have significant salt buildup, where we do have quite a bit of soil contamination, that the long-term viability of farming is in question in that whole region, the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. I've spoken to many, many people about this, and what you find is that the typical large-scale farm business person that we talk to says, well, I could grow broccoli on concrete. Just give me the fertilizer and the chemicals and I'll do it. I said, but you're not doing that now. There must be a reason. and so we get into quite a bit of discussion around it. The long-term viability is the most important question, I think, from the environmental perspective that we're going to face for the future. With only 5% of the land in urban development right now in the Central Valley, 95% in agriculture, and that's the core of our economy. Yeah, we got to think about that. But most people don't like to think long term. Most people thinking about, that midterm that's coming up in 2 weeks, or thinking about, how they're going to make their next round of payments, or if you're a farmer, thinking about how you're going to pay your bills and where the money's going to come from. So thinking long term is a much more difficult question when you're sitting in that kind of a situation. Even with respect to the immigration issue, The long-term solution of the immigration problem is economic development in the sending countries. If people could earn a living there, they wouldn't have to get across the triple fences and face getting killed or whatever and pay $1,000 to the coyote to get across. If they had a job down there, that would pay them enough to live on.
But then the farmers would have to pay enough.
That's right. Well, you got your choice. You can either do it here or let it go and have Mexicans do it in Mexico. I mean, that's really the choice. But your question is a very good one, and not enough people are speaking out on that question of the long-term viability. The organic farming folks, sustainable agriculture folks are speaking out on it, but mostly through the way in which they do business, not as a policy question. Question here.
Regarding immigration, undocumented workers, it's a problem in other states as well. I think it was 2 years ago, the immigration bill was up, and there was a proposal to did not immigration law, which seems to be a very specific escalation on your program enforcing current immigration law. And that's for a reason. And that's at a national level. It was backed up by large production companies. What happens here? What's happening at the state level as far as policy, like policy?
Okay. Officially, the state of California is not responsible for immigration policy at the U.S. level. I mean, that's officially the case. On the other hand, because of the tremendous importance of immigrants in California and in the Central Valley especially, our governor and the administration over the last 8 years has been pushing very, very hard to try to figure out ways to restrict immigration. And the way in which they've gone about it is kind of weird. For example, first thing was, let's ask everybody who applies for a driver's license whether they're a legal immigrant or not. And let's not give driver's licenses to anybody who can't prove they're a legal immigrant. Well, think about it. What impact is that going to have on the sale of fraudulent documents? It's like, you're helping the people who have this underground economy make a lot of money with this law. Then it gets worse. In Sanger Municipal Court, Sanger is a town in the Central Valley just to the east of Fresno, people who are now brought in because they don't have a driver's license then demonstrate that they're not legal residents, and so catch-22, they can't get one. So this woman down in the court down there figured out this clever solution. What we got to do is we want these folks to be safe drivers. We want them to know the laws. We want them to behave in a proper way while driving in the streets of California. Let's create a diversion program, and let's have people pass the same test that you and I have to pass in this special diversion program. Of course, that provides employment for the people who are conducting those classes and fills up space, and everybody's a winner. That's one simple thing that was done to try to deal with it at the state level with all kinds of disastrous consequences. I think people ought to be required to have insurance and pass a driver's test and all of that, and it's really not very wise to do the kinds of things we're doing. Here's the real downside consequence. We've had in Fresno County and Madera County together in a 2-year period 29 fatalities in multi-fatality accidents involving vans driven by unlicensed, undocumented folks taking crews to the fields. That's the real downside. My son-in-law's in the highway patrol. He's got to clean up the mess when that happens. So the consequences are very severe of this law. Now we have 200 additional laws that are intended to try to, at the state level, deal with undocumented immigrants. So for example, if you want to get any kind of a license, whether you're doing a construction business, whether you're operating a beauty parlor or whatever that's regulated by the state, you now have to prove that you're a legal resident. That's just another example. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. If you go to Employment Development Department, you got to prove that you're a legal resident to get unemployment insurance. You got to prove that you're a legal resident to get a job referral. So we have a system that is sort of careening with all these crazy little things, but not addressing the core problem.
It's also contradictory to the national non-program, which is to be illegal for undocumented
Yeah.
workers to keep this
Thing going. Yeah. Nuts. Makes no sense. We've even had cases of individuals who come to us. We get a lot of requests from folks who want some assistance of one sort or another. And one guy went into PG&E in Lodi, California to get utilities hooked up to the place they're living. And the clerk at the desk said, "Show me your papers." Yeah, to get PG&E? There's no law that governs that. I mean, it's just crazy. But it's the kind of reckless stuff that begins to happen once you pursue this path.
I believe it was in the town for a year when you went out and counted the undocumented health housing. Is that the only place you did that?
That's the only place we've done it to date, systematically. And by systematic, I mean in a really sound scientific fashion.
Because I was counting them, and there
Yeah.
were twice as many
Right.
physical houses that were visited.
That's right, it's nuts.
So are you planning on looking into this even further?
Yes, yeah, I don't want to get into the details, but we just got a major grant to do this in 7 communities throughout agricultural areas of the state, in which we'll also be looking at the health status of the population. So we're going to link, for the first time, working and living conditions with health status, and do physical exams as well as self-reported information. So yes, we think this is very important, and we're going to time it so that it's done at exactly the same time as the census. Question here.
Are there any special efforts being made to educate children in health community?
There are, but it's mostly pretty haphazard. For example, there are funded programs to teach English as a second language, for example. There are funded programs to teach folks about health and safety things and so forth. But most of those programs are very, very small scale relative to demand. So for example, a community like Parlier, the demand for ESL class is enormous. Everybody wants to go to an ESL class, but there's not enough classes. There are volunteer-based organizations, for example, El Colegio Popular in Fresno, that recruits and trains volunteer teachers. And tonight, you can go to the Fresno Diocese, where their offices are located, and in the school building that's used for regular school in the day, in the evening, there'll be several hundred adults, including people my age, learning to read and write for the first time. And those are very inspiring programs because they're people who are very dedicated, they see the need, they're trying to address it, and they're trying to do a very responsible job. But the resources for those kinds of things are very limited. Another issue that we face is that about half of the folks who work as hired farm workers don't own anything, not even a car. So how do you get to a place where there's school? Or how do you get to a place where there are services? It's a very tough question. And so that gets back to, you know, public transportation, it gets back to our infrastructure, it gets back to how we organize our lives in California.
I think we have time for more questions.
Okay, very patient gentleman over here.
You mentioned that the diocese was providing space for health activities. What general connection is there between religious interests and spiritually oriented community and needs?
Yeah, good question. What we see is a very significant initiative both from the Catholic Church as well as from a number of Protestant denominations to try to support volunteer-based activities in the community. Those efforts are quite limited in scope, in the sense that if you can imagine the need being this big and the resources available that big, that's the nature of the problem. So one of the kinds of things that now is being tried out for the first time is a exchange of services for volunteer time. So for example, California Rural Legal Assistance that provides legal help to legal resident immigrants only are asking people under this time dollar concept to give volunteer time in exchange for the services that the attorneys have provided to them and their family. And it seems to be catching on. People like the idea. That is that there is a real equality, if you will, in that relationship, rather than just somebody, sort of gratefully accepting, the help that an expert provides. So that's very encouraging. Probably the most exciting development, in my view, is an organization called the Sacramento Valley Organizing Community, which does community organizing through the parish or individual congregation level. And they've organized several thousand folks in the Sacramento Valley. They also have a political agenda. It's not widely understood, but nonprofit, tax-exempt organizations like ours are prohibited from spending any resources on direct lobbying, okay? It doesn't apply to churches. Churches can do whatever they want, which is kind of interesting in this country. And so they figured that